Appreciate you guys coming. My name is Josh Royce. I'm the regional supervisor for the Southwest region, Idaho Fish and Game. And that Southwest region encompasses our Nampa office and the McCall office. It goes from the Nevada border to Riggins and the Oregon border over essentially to the Middle Fork of the Salmon. So that's our neck of the woods. We've got about 65 to 70 staff members that work there, fisheries wildlife enforcement staff. They're represented here. We've got a pretty robust and diverse group of staff members here from a lot of different programs to hopefully answer questions and provide some input on what we're here to talk about, which is obviously this year's fire situation in the area and what the response and rehab might be and what we might expect to see from a big game in particular standpoint for the next few years. So again, I appreciate you guys being here. Some of the things that we will talk about tonight are the things that we do know. We've got a lot of data and metrics. Idaho Fish and Game spends a lot of time collecting information on big game herd populations all across the state, but in this area in particular. And that information is really important in moments like this where we're trying to figure out what we might see moving forward, what we might do from a management standpoint. So we use that information to inform management outcomes, and those look like harvest, seasons, methods of take, tag numbers, etc. All of those things are involved in that process, and these are the folks that help inform those decisions. So again, my role as a regional supervisor is to supervise the region. We have a commissioner that oversees the region. It's appointed by the governor, sits on the commission. That's the governing board. Unfortunately, Commissioner Murphy could not be here tonight. I talked to him on the way here. He's dealing with a family emergency and couldn't be here, although he intended to, and gives you all his best and his appreciation for being here. So one of the things that we will talk about tonight is the things that we don't know. And there are a lot of things on the big game front that we don't know. The science of wildlife management is more populated by the things that we don't know than the things that we do. And this is no different here. We don't know what the winter holds for us. We don't know what these big game populations' responses will be to some of these fires. This area is unique. As you know, some of you have been here for a very, very long time. Dino, I'm not looking at you or saying anything about your tenure or anything, but some of you have been here for a long time and have a long history in the area and a long set of knowledge of the area. I'm from Idaho originally, grew up in this part of the world, spent my time here in the 80s and 90s in the Garden Valley area, and I know what some of the feeding operations looked like here. We will talk about winter feeding today. That is a tool that is on the table. It's something that we don't tend to like to use for a variety of reasons, and those of you that were here when we had more robust winter feeding operations in the valley understand that, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of when we feed and why we don't. But also one of the things that we talk about here is this is a pretty unique place for a lot of reasons, but in terms of big game and their response and how they utilize the habitat here, because we've got a variety of habitats. We've got summer and transitional ranges that are very close in proximity to winter ranges, and some of the biological staff will talk about that and how these animals move across the landscape, and that they do occupy some pretty subpar winter range as it is without fire in the landscape. So more to come on that, but I wanted to introduce that. We will have plenty of opportunity for questions afterwards. We've got a couple of different segments of presentations. We're going to start off with the Forest Service, and my appreciation to Scott and Brant for being here to help fill this out, because we manage the wildlife in the state of Idaho, but we very rarely manage the landscapes on which they depend. And so significant appreciation to the Forest Service for coming here and helping us understand what the fire situation was, what their responses have been, and what rehab we might see moving forward. So very much thank you. We will start out with those guys going for about 30 minutes, and then some of our wildlife biologists for about 30 minutes, and then we'll leave it open for comments. We'll stay, I won't say as long as you want, because my staff does want to get home to their families, but we will make sure that we get your questions answered. We'll stay here at least until 8. So with that, any housekeeping questions before we get going on some of the presentations? Staff, what am I forgetting? Okay. Brant, Scott?
Thanks, Josh. And as Josh mentioned, my name is Brant Peterson. I'm the forest supervisor here on the Boise National Forest. And I started June 5th of 1995 in Idaho City. And the summer before that, 94, if you remember back that far for some of you, we had a fire that was the Rabbit Creek Fire. And I was on a fire crew and came here in 94 to Idaho City. And I remember Terry Teeter, if any of you know that name, said to me, "This is the biggest fire that we've ever had. It's the biggest fire you'll ever see on this landscape, and just, you know, go into this fire knowing that this is burning like no other fire we've ever seen." And since then, as you all well know, we've had summer after summer and some really big fires. We've had Pioneer and some other fires that have burned, devastated the landscape up here, and this summer was no different. In fact, this summer, not by acres, it wasn't the most acres that we burned, but definitely the most complex system of fires that we've had on the Boise National Forest. And truly started in July 21st and burned right through until the snow fell, and actually burned a little bit after that. So I'll hit a little bit, and what I kind of plan to do, I'll talk a little bit about the fires themselves, just to build some foundation, a little bit of background. Most of you lived through that, I'm assuming, so you know that piece of it. But also talk a bit about the fire rehab work that we're doing, that we've started on, some of what we've completed and what we plan to do in the future. And then Scott and myself will stay around for a bit after if there's specific questions or if you have any concerns. But before I start, there's some papers up here. This is a scoping letter for some of the work that we're going to do. It gives an opportunity for the public to comment on the work. And I also have just a hand-sized map you can look at that shows some of the fire boundary. So you're welcome to grab those, and if you haven't, if you want one while I'm talking, I can sure pass them out. So just starting back, the Boise National Forest in 2021 was designated as one of 10 critical landscapes under the Wildfire Crisis Strategy and WCS, and the particular area here was called the SIL, or the Southern Idaho Landscape. And that included 4 of our 5 districts on the Boise National Forest. And the reason that I start with that is they designated those 4 landscapes, those 4 districts, as one of the 10 most threatened landscapes in the entire country. And so part of that was, we're going to reduce the fuels, we're going to take some actions, because we recognized with the level of fuels, the dryness of the fuels that exist here, that the modeling showed that this was particularly an area that was likely to burn. And so we started that in 2021. We've ramped up prescribed fire, we've ramped up some commercial work that we've done as in logging, and we've also ramped up our pre-commercial thinning. So we built, not necessarily with the Forest Service, but we built with our partners as well, a lot of work that's gone into that. Obviously, there's still a great deal of need, and that'll be one common thread that I kind of weave through tonight. The fires that we experienced this summer were devastating. The fires that we experienced this summer were huge, but there's still a lot of ground that is at risk, and there's still a lot of fuel that is very dry, and we'll continue to treat that ground before it burns. But fire is part of this ecosystem, and it'll continue to happen. And it is an unfortunate part of this beautiful ground we all love, but it is a vulnerable piece of landscape. So this summer, started in July, we had 3 major lightning events. July 21st, if you remember that, August 8th, and August 17th. They were the 3 big lightning events. We had smaller storms mixed in there, but just for some perspective, we had 285 lightning strikes that actually touched the ground between July 21st and July 23rd. So a huge lightning storm came through, and that started the majority of these fires. And then again, happened again on August 8th, another dry lightning storm. Less lightning hit the ground, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200, but still a big lightning bust that week. And then followed up with the last one was there August 18th, 17th and 18th. Each one of those created fires that started obviously and grew quite fast. And it was really from July 20th on, we were in National Level Preparedness 5, which is the highest level we can be on. And what that really means is there's a lot of fires across the country that are all demanding resources. And so they assigned those out at a national level. And so we were competing with all the other fires that were across the West. And as you look at that and remember, the Badlands fire was in Oregon, if you remember that burned that whole northeast part of Oregon. Huge land. I think it ended up being somewhere near 500,000 acres. And then the Paddock fire followed that, which was out of kind of that area that's to the west of Sweet Nola, burned into that Indian Valley area and over to the east of that. So those fires were before the 3 lightning storms that I mentioned. We really started our season off on the 21st, and right from the get-go, we knew it was going to be a big season. We ordered a Type 1 team on July 22nd, and we had at least one and sometimes multiple teams here on the Boise from that date all the way through to the 3rd week of September, and then we took them back on the Boise National Forest. At times, we had 3,800 firefighters, just firefighters, not counting the overhead that you see that were camped right here by the high school. That, at one time, that was our highest count, so nearly 4,000 firefighters spread across the Boise. So really big summer. Here on the Boise, we had 66 fires total that we responded to with 1 module. That means 1 crew for a 24-hour period. And for context, I'm throwing a lot of numbers out, but the previous high number was 38 fires that we responded to with an entire module for a 24-hour period. So we went from roughly 40 to 66. So it really speaks to the number of fires that were started and the number of responses, the number of fires we responded to. And through that, we had approximately 10% of the Boise burn. So a big chunk of the ground burned, and a big chunk of the suitable timber ground. This northern part of the forest is typically our more suitable timber ground. A big chunk of that burned as well. And so a big summer, lots of activity, and lots of firefighters on the ground. So that really, that's kind of covering how the fire season, and I shrink what was a long and really challenging fire season down just to about 5 or 10 minutes, because I really want to hit on the next part of that, which is the fire rehab piece. There's three actions we take post-fire. Before the fire is even out, we start with a BEAR team, which is Burned Area Emergency Recovery Team. And that generally is forest specialists that are on the Boise, but because of the number of fires we had, we borrowed a lot of other specialists, which are hydrologists, engineers, wildlife bio, fish bio, foresters. So a full gamut are on those BEAR teams, and they do an immediate rapid assessment to tell us what burned, what's the intensity of what burned, and what's most at risk. And that's usually the infrastructure that follows, because the storms that come in post-fire, as you guys well know, usually involve, they have a lot of surface flow, and it compromises all of the culverts, bridges, creeks, and all of the infrastructure that's associated with that we continue to need to not only suppress the fires, but to do the BEAR work. So we immediately do a rapid assessment on the infrastructure. We move into the vegetation part of that second, and then the recreational infrastructure is usually third. So that's kind of the steps of the BEAR process. It moves from that suppression repair and the emergency BEAR work, and the last part of that that's up there is the long-term restoration, is what we call BAR, all these acronyms. It's another team that actually goes in and physically does the work, and that's funded from a different source, and that's already started. We worked for the last couple of months replacing culverts, cleaning culverts, getting the infrastructure ready to run the water down that we assume will come off this spring off these burned areas. And then lastly, foresters went out and did an assessment of the ground, and they look at the burn intensity, they look at what vegetation burned and the type of vegetation that burned to help determine areas that will most likely plant. And that's done quickly because we have to plant the seeds in the ground down at Lucky Peak Nursery right away so that they can get to a size that we can actually put them in the ground which generally is a 2-year period to get to that, but we already have some seedlings in the ground that we can start with this spring, right? As soon as the snow melts, we'll chase the snow up with some planting efforts. So once we're done with that assessment, we understand how it burned, we understand what burned, and we understand some of the actions we're going to take. We move into the last part, which is our long-term assessment on what actions we'll take, and I've listed these up here. So the first thing that we'll look at is mitigating some of the hazard trees along the roads and trails. So the trees that burned adjacent to the road, generally it's about a tree height, sometimes we go 2 tree heights. We'll remove those hazard trees. And what we found, and especially after the Pioneer Fire, if you remember that fire from a few years ago, we took care of the level 1 and our primary routes, but those trees continued to fall. And in fact, I was the ranger there, and they fell for years after that. And they created, every windstorm we had, our roads were blocked again with trees, and we went back out and cut those again, and we went back out and cut them again. So we're gonna really make a conscious effort to go out. We've already started some of that work with our fire crews and a few contact crews to remove those hazard trees, and that'll be really a focus of this fall, this early winter, and then we'll get back out there in the spring. We're looking at some commercial salvage areas. So in other words, we'll do some logging, and we'll remove one is to get the economic value out of those trees, but also removing those trees means that we're able to get in there and plant safely, and we're able to get in there and plant quicker and get those seeds generated before the brush comes up and creates these big ceanothus brush fields, not just ceanothus, but these big brush fields that are difficult for the trees to get established. So we want to move quick with some commercial logging and move quick with that planting to follow that. We'll replant improve the watershed conditions, so that's part of the Replant Act that we'll do. We'll continue to do, we'll monitor, when we suppress the fires, we use dozers and we use hand lines. Both of those two are really common. I'm sure you all seen them that work in this last summer and the past. So we'll identify those. We already know where they are. We GPS those as they're built during the fire, but we'll go back out, we'll rip those if needed, we'll seed those when needed. Most importantly, we'll go to the entrance of those from the primary road to where that skid trail starts, and we'll block those routes off so that they don't become UTV or ATV trails. And the reason is, one, we don't want unauthorized or non-maintained trails to be built. But the second part of that is, and what happens quickly is, UTVs, ATVs, all of that will tend to use those skid routes to get back into areas, and they take noxious weeds from our system of roads back into the backcountry on those routes. So we really want to focus on closing those routes as quick as possible and making sure they stay closed. We do have some grazing allotments in and around this area and all the way up towards West Mountain and even some that are over further on to the Sawtooth area. So we'll look at each one of those, we'll assess those and determine what's the rehabilitation period for those grazing allotments. And the last is, depending upon the damage we have, we assume, because based on past fires, it happens, that we'll have infrastructure damage, roads, trails, campgrounds, that type of damage. And so we're set, we're building the road crew, we're getting some of that together to take care of those if and when those happen in the spring and through next summer. And that infrastructure repair work will continue for years to come. It'll be 2 or 3 years, depending upon how the water comes off these areas that were burned. Covered a bit of this, so as we go through this, right now we're really going in and doing some rehab on the ground. Again, we're closing skid trails. The spike camps that were built, we're scarifying that a little bit, replanting all those right away. Hopefully get that seed down this fall so that the grass can come up in the spring. And again, that's for 2 reasons. It holds the soil down, and it also keeps noxious weeds from getting in there. Next, we've got, of course, I hit on this already. I should have waited and looked at the slides, but we have that timber salvage harvest. We've got folks looking at that. We're cruising some of that timber now, assessing that value and working with the mills to see what products that they can take and what they need. Some of that work will start as early as this spring coming up and go through the next couple of years. The infrastructure repair, we've had a little bit of damage so far, not a lot, but this is a typical slide, and I think that the light's good enough in here you can see, but really typical to see post-fire. Water comes down, washes out our culverts, bridges, and we'll make sure we monitor that, and we've got equipment in place and people in place that can help repair that damage as it happens, and that's a big part of the fire rehab. And then lastly, starting this spring, as soon as the snow starts melting, we'll start with the planting piece of it, and like I had already covered, we'll have most of that seed was collected this summer, and it was not collected because of the fire. It was actually a side effort that we were doing, but they collected about 1,300 bushels of low elevation pine, ponderosa pine, and some Doug fir. So we already have that seed source that they were collecting pre-fire and during the fire, which was a separate effort. It had nothing to do with the fire, but it really will help bolster our seed source. And then lastly, when we look at this, we'll do a planning document. Once we assess what we need to do, that this document here outlines what I've talked about, but we'll take public comment, and the scoping period's open. You can read that on the front page there. Basically, we ask the public, this is what our intentions are, or this is what our actions that we are asking, and we'll follow through with. But what else are we missing? What comments do you have on there? And the comment period's open, and there's contact information in there for the scoping piece of that. So we'll finish the NEPA piece as we go through. The NEPA is the planning part, the document that allows us to do the work, and then we'll start with that action or continue with that action into the next couple of years. And so that's really the fire rehab piece. I think the last part of that I'll just cover. I think it's important, and I talked about the wildfire crisis strategy, but really, how do we address the dry fuels we have, the dry conditions? We had 3 record-setting days this summer, temperature-wise, drier forest conditions, higher temperatures. How do we address that so we can continue to deal with the fire? So there's really 2 parts that I really want to stay focused on. I don't want to lose sight of the fire rehab piece. It's really important that we do that. The ground needs it, and that'll be our primary focus. But the second focus, and I think as important, is the work that we need to continue to do to reduce the hazardous fuels. That's absolutely critical that we continue to do that work and that we continue to reduce those fuels. Otherwise, we'll be right back in the same cycle, and it pulls us away from that important work, which again is commercial, pre-commercial thinning, and some prescribed fire work. We've got to continue to do that as we do the fire rehab. So we really have a 2-pronged approach over the next 2 summers, and the fuels work will continue on into the future. So that's really the 3 parts of that. And I think I'll stay around after we're done. We can talk or answer any questions that anybody has, but that's really the presentation that I have. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I was just going to do, as Josh alluded to, there's so much nitty-gritty we can get into. This is a complex system where the fires went through everything from that high country down to the low country, so winter range and summer range. But just to step back a little bit, we're mostly focused on big game for tonight, so deer and elk, and just background, and because we're going to kind of highlight a bunch of these things, but it's going to be high level. So just, a lot of people think deer and elk, they eat most of the same stuff. They're similar critters, but they're actually quite different. So your mule deer are more browsers, so they need more forbs, woody vegetation, less grazers. They're not eating so much grasses. The growth cycle of her fawn is really driven by how much weight that female has going into the birthing season. You make a bigger fawn, the fawn's going to live or have a better chance of living throughout its first year of life. Up in this cycle, or the system with the fires up here, it takes a little bit longer for your forbs, to get a bitter brush that's this tall than it takes grass to come back. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And throughout our collaring data and just biology, usually the fawns are the ones that die, or the really old ones. Your middle-aged animals, they have enough body mass that they can make it through a bad year. often, not all the time, there's always some mortality, but so we're mostly thinking fawns are going to take this fire cycle the hardest. So then talking about elk, they're the grazers. They're more feeding off grasses, so you have a fire come through, that kind of switch is your ground cover component, and you have a lot more grasses that can come back, next spring you can have plenty of tall, nutritious grass. One concern after a fire is some of these invasive annual grasses, things like cheatgrass, medusa head. They do have some value, particularly early in the spring, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, cheatgrass dies right away. It doesn't have much nutritional value. It's not really enough to power growing a baby elk. They need more of their native species, more of a mix of species, not just uniform invasive annual grasses. And we do know a couple species like wheatgrass and fescue. Love to see that out on the landscape. Some reseeding efforts and things will try to put more of that stuff in to outcompete those invasive annual grasses that are going to want to come in. It's their perfect opportunity. They have a clear landscape, they can come in. That's why they're invasive. They're really good at doing that. So that's just basic what deer and elk eat. They all need cover, when it's cold and frosty like this, they need a place to hide, or windy, so they do need cover, they need water. But kind of the big thing that changes with fire is what kind of food sources they have. So here, what makes it hard, the paddock was kind of easier because it was more of one range type, but here we're talking about both the winter and the summer range. Typically, lower elevation is your winter range, right? They're getting out of the cold temperatures on the mountaintops. Down in this area, there is a 100 to 200 year fire regime. We keep getting whacked with these fires. As going through a little history of your time on the forest and hearing how many have come, there's been a lot here recently. So that winter range has been getting hit. As I said, when you have these fires, there's a good chance your invasive species are going to come in. So if we're having a lot of fires and the landscape hasn't had time to recover, there is a good chance you have a high percentage of invasive, or relatively high percentage of invasive species on the landscape. So that we were already aware was somewhat limiting these populations. The winter range, just having rapid succession of fires, you often have these invasive species coming in. And then another thing that's kind of changed is these fires are so big that maybe on the edges seeds can blow in and you have some recovery from that. But when these fires are at this massive, massive scale, it's hard to get that seed source. If all the seeds burnt up and you have a 100,000 acre fire, you don't really have some neighboring seeds that can just blow over and start the recovery process. So that's another thing we're concerned about, is just the scale of the fires we're having. Now switching gears, then you go up high. It's usually more moist up high. Typically there's less travel corridors, so less people are running around really high, spreading all those weeds. Because a lot of those areas are more kind of grasslands and they're closer to the clouds where the lightning comes from, the fire regime there is usually a little bit shorter, but also the landscapes evolve for that. There's more of these big open grassy patches and then your timber stands. And less likely for invasive species. I think a lot of that's just the amount of people that are up in the high country versus the bottom. They're not spreading weeds as much. And just, it's not open land, right? It's covered in snow a good chunk of the year, so there's just less opportunity for that. And just being higher, cooler, you have more of these mosaic spotty fires. And that might have been it, actually. So understanding that biology of them, when we're looking at these fires, generally it has, well, elk are bigger, they're a little bit more resilient just because of that. They move around a little bit more. Your deer will tend to be like, mom taught me to go to this one spot, and that deer and their babies go to that same spot. Fire or not, that's where they go. Elk tend to be like, oh, there was a fire, I can go move somewhere else. And so they move around and find some good habitat. Deer tend to go to the same spot time and time again. And then the other thing, because of just the diet needs of the two different species, those elk might not have so much nutrition feed this year, but come spring, that grass is going to be coming up and they'll be able to eat that. Whereas the deer need a little bit more time to have those shrubs that they really like, that really give them that healthy, good body size. And so these fires tend to, because of the site fidelity and just the food selection that they have, fires kind of hit deer a little bit harder too.
I'm getting set up here. Good time to take a sip of water, shuffle some papers, reconsider your life choices. Okay, mule deer. So the mule deer affected by this fire are part of a greater population of mule deer that are what we like to call the Central Mountain Data Analysis Unit of mule deer. And what lumps them together is, shared migration routes, shared life history patterns, genetics, interbreeding populations. But within this population affected by this fire, we were looking at the ones in units 33, 34, 35, and 36. Very similar to elk as well. When it comes wintertime, the deer in these units are coming down and essentially wintering around that south-facing slope all along the Banks Norman Highway for the most part, and then up Highway 21 going up into 36. As those snow levels come down, they tend to get more and more pushed towards the Garden Valley area. Okay, so one of the ways to look at numbers of impacted animals is just by looking at the numbers of individuals that were impacted in the wintering population in this neck of the woods. So the numbers up here represent mule deer that were counted in GMU's 33 and 35 during the wintering surveys. Important thing to remember is that some of the deer that show up here during the hunting season, they winter elsewhere, so they would not have been affected by the fire during the wintering season. For these fires in particular, the Wapiti fire really, in terms of when we're surveying in the winter, is at the far eastern edge in that more northern, snowier part, and by the time we survey, typically most of the mule deer are down in the valley here. So minimal wintering deer impacts. We'll get into other impacts with them outside of wintering deer though. The Middle Fork complex itself, anywhere from 25 to 38% of the mule deer that winter here locally could be impacted. Sounds like a lot, but we also have low densities of deer here. So that's pretty much anywhere from about 330 to 516 individuals that we've counted along all these areas. This map in particular, these highlighted red areas are where we saw higher concentrations of mule deer while we were flying, and the yellow ones are where we saw lower concentrations of mule deer while we were flying, and then just the general boundaries of the fires themselves. Outside of winter range habitat for mule deer though, a lot of these areas are transitional range where the deer transition through on their way from winter range to summer range and summer range to winter range. I'll get into this too with elk, but I've been hearing that individuals have been seeing a bit more deer and elk showing up into town earlier this year, and part of that could be because some of these animals are just passing straight on through the burnt winter range areas and transitional ranges to get to closer to terminal winter range areas. In terms of impact to summer range, we really don't know what that's going to look like just yet. A lot of these areas that are further in the backcountries are places where we have lots of calving and fawning grounds area, and that could potentially impact mule deer populations in like the short-term period of the next 5 to 10 years or so. For elk, we're part of the Sawtooth zone here, GMUs 33, 34, 35, and 36. A good portion of our elk winter along that same Banks-Loman Highway corridor, but also, again, a lot of them also leave the zone altogether for the wintering area. So for this winter season, the elk that are going to be impacted are the ones that are here along the highway. So that wintering elk impact, again, These are a little bit different. The map here, for this one I can actually pull the individual locations of the groups that we were counting as we were going along and surveying populations while flying. And you can really see, you know, where they're at, you know, how close they are to the highway in some of these places and how far back they get in other places. For the most part, that Wapiti fire really didn't impact too much of the wintering population, whereas that Middle Fork complex is going to be impacting anywhere from 11 to 16% of our wintering elk here. And that's based off of our most recent population level count that we did in 2023 when we flew for a couple weeks up here. Again, that transitional range, elk passing through quicker into town, showing up on winter range with less fat on them, as well as in terms of their summer range, you know, a lot of these areas are modeled high-use calving ground areas as well. In particular, you know, the fires around like the Danskin boat ramp area, that really tended to be like in terms of invasive weeds and noxious weeds rather too. The transitional range for us where we started to see like a lot of that nastier plants start to show up. And so in terms of habitat recovery out there, that's one of those places that we're keenly interested in seeing have a positive recovery because it is one of those more well-used areas for our wintering deer and elk. And Pete, you're up next.
So I guess one of the big questions, and probably the reason you guys are here tonight, is in the short term, what are we going to do about it? As David highlighted, you know, the potential for loss of feed is there. One of the things that he pointed out, and maybe didn't emphasize, was that with a lot of that transitional range burning, you know, it wasn't terminal winter range where those animals are going to spend their winter, but some of the question is, are those animals moving through transitional range quicker than they would in previous years? Are they getting to winter range sooner, you know, and therefore consuming forage that's available on winter range quicker than they would in a typical year? You know, so that brings up sort of what options do we have? You know, if we have extra animals and not enough feed, you know, there's really a couple of ways we can go with that. You can reduce the number of mouths that are on the landscape, or you can add feed to the landscape. You know, that's kind of the two things you can do, or nothing. So kind of brings up the point of emergency big game feeding. If you guys are familiar with that in the area, folks that have been here for a while, we do have a history of feeding in the area, as Josh kind of alluded to. Years ago, there was just a feeding program that went annually. We had feed sites up and down. That was abandoned, I believe, in the late 90s. I was very small in the 90s, so I don't know. But as far as emergency feeding, we've had 3 events in this millennia, 2001, 2009, and the most recent one in 2017. And those were all precipitated due to extremely harsh winter conditions. So as an agency, we have a policy that we will maintain populations at a level that is supported by naturally available forage. So unlike some other western states in Idaho, our population levels, we want to maintain those. What food is naturally available on the ground? How much can that support? That's how many animals, you know, we strive for. That's kind of our target objectives for those populations. So our goal is not to supplementally feed them. We do have authorization under state statute to feed under emergency situations if there's a few things in place. And so those are kind of listed up there. One of the reasons we would do it is to prevent private property damage, deer and elk getting into causing infrastructure issues, getting onto highways, those sorts of things, something that poses a public safety risk. To prevent excessive mortality, if we feel like this is a one-off, there are conditions that exist because of some natural weather phenomenon that's just a one-off this year, and we can mitigate some of that by adding in feed. You know, and the last one is winter forage. So, you know, the two things there would be kind of extreme drought in the summer that prevents forage production, fire that prevents available forage, you know, or a big winter. So that's one of the things we're looking at this year. We get the question a lot, well, why wouldn't you just feed all the time? You know, so going back to our policy is that we want to maintain populations at a naturally available level. There are also some other big concerns that people often don't think about. You know, the first one up there, big game habituation. We saw some very real effects of that in 2009, most recently 2017. You know, animals coming down to some of these feed sites. Actually, these feed sites are going to be places that we can access throughout the winter. You know, 17 was a lot of big snow. Most of those feed sites were right there, congregated on the highway. We don't want to habituate animals in subsequent years to come back and think, hey, this is the place that you know, we're going to be feeding at. We want them spread out on the landscape naturally. Impacts on migration. We don't want to short stop animals to where they're not moving back and forth. We see some of that already right here in the Garden Valley area. You guys are probably well aware of you know, the elk that are down there. I saw them driving in tonight down there at the gravel pit that don't migrate. We don't want to encourage that sort of behavior. By pushing animals in unnatural concentrations in certain areas, we can further degrade landscapes that are already prone to degradation. You know, so that's one big concern. Bringing in predators. You know, if you put a bunch of animals in a place that are unnaturally there, we see this in Garden Valley. We see it in places like Haley, where we have town deer, we have town elk. All of a sudden, we have town lions. Town deer are pretty cool. Town lions aren't nearly as fun. You know, Corey loves town lions. One of the real big concerns, and it's something that's been in the news a lot if you follow Fish and Game stuff, is the potential for disease transmission. So we do have chronic wasting disease in the state now. We have brucellosis, but not in this portion of the state. When you unnaturally congregate animals, it's just like people. You jam a whole bunch of people into a room, and one of them's sick, the likelihood of those other individuals getting sick, you know, is much higher. And so some of the long-term questions is, what are the potential impacts on the short term if we feed? Are we going to get some more of these animals through this winter? But are we introducing disease into the system or spreading disease at a higher rate? So at the moment, we have been testing for chronic wasting disease here in the Sawtooth zone and the Central Mountain DAU. We haven't detected it, but it is, you know, it is right next door to us. So that's a very real concern. You know, does the risk outweigh the benefit there? You know, the big question that we ask is, what is the desired outcome? Why would we feed? What do we hope to achieve? And if by feeding, can we achieve that? You know, if the question is a lot of deer and elk getting onto the highway or getting into feedlots, and we can feed outside that area and pull elk away, pull deer away, you know, that might be a good reason to go. David shared some of the numbers that might be impacted. You know, feeding 300 deer to 500 deer, that's a pretty big task. So can we effectively feed that many deer? You know, that's one of the questions that we ask when we do that. Yeah, we kind of hit all that other stuff. So I said a lot, and I didn't answer the question, are we going to feed? At the moment, we don't actually know. So one of the things that we have in place, we have a winter feeding advisory committee. It's a group of public citizens, one of them's in the room here today, from different places across our winter range in this region. So we have a representative from Garden Valley and Weiser and the Emmett area that look at conditions on the ground. And we say, what are the present conditions and is it appropriate to feed? We have this advisory committee. We meet monthly in the wintertime if necessary. We've already had our first meeting this year. We look at, you know, is it an appropriate thing to do? What are the conditions? You know, when would we trigger that? So for us here in the Southwest, one of the biggest things we're looking at going into this winter is, what does the precipitation look like? We're in this La Nina transition year. The last time we had a La Nina transition year was 16-17. Everybody's calling for lots of extra moisture this year. The question is that extra moisture come as wet, rainy moisture, or does it come as cold, snowy moisture? If it's wet, rainy moisture, that's probably good for mule deer and elk in this area. If it's cold, snowy moisture and we have lots of snow, that's not good for deer and elk in this issue. So that's one of the things that we're looking at is, you know, what are temperatures doing, what is the winter doing, and so we're very adaptive with that. We are prepared to feed if necessary, but our preference is not to feed. So if you guys have questions on that, I will be around for a bit. If you have questions on how the committee works, who makes those decisions, what the specific criteria are, come and snag me afterwards, and we can get to that. Are you jumping in, Ryan, or am I continue to go?
Do you want me to? I can finish this out.
Sure. I love to talk, so.
So the last thing that, we get a lot of questions about is, how can I help as an individual when we're talking about these kind of large scale fires? Some quick ones, we're talking about, we had the Valley Fire in the Boise Valley, Paddock Fire, we have these fires up here in Middle Fork Complex, Wapiti Fire, and we're talking about these animals come and concentrate. Depending on the weather that we get, we could get some more of these big game animals pushing down into the valley, right? Closer to residents, closer toward the towns. So some typical tips, right? So drive more alert, especially during the early morning and the evenings. If they really do push down in bad winter, they're going to be there day in, day out, all hours of the day. Some common things we could see, old wire fences that are dilapidated, might be good to remove those. They don't get tangled in them. Removing toxic plants, things like Japanese yew. Those kind of things are detrimental to our elk in particular and deer. It only takes about a cup of yew leaves to kill an adult elk. So if you have that here in the valley, let us know. We have people that can help figure out a way to help get that removed. Let us know about that. Covered pointed fences. We get that a lot, but on occasion in the valley, some of these old picket fences or wire fences that have the posts on them, animals jump over, they don't make it, they impale themselves on them. So that's what we're talking about, either covering them. If you don't have the ability to remove them, go ahead and cover them up. We already talked about this with Peter. The best thing, we didn't get into it specifically, but deer have a specialized diet. Elk are a little bit more lenient in what they can eat, but we still recommend that you do not feed the wildlife. Keep wildlife wild is our goal here. Depending on how hot the feed is, it can kill the deer and elk. It can also spread disease and parasites. And again, we talked about that short-stopping normal movement patterns of our big game species. If you're out in the field, doing hikes, enjoying as you should out in the forest, give wildlife space, keep pets leashed, check your clothes for seeds. Again, we're talking about those noxious weeds. We do have some opportunities. That's what the QR code is up here. We do have some handouts if you want to take some with you that have QR codes about how you can help. We do have volunteer projects throughout, at least here in the Southwest region, more Paddock and Valley Fire, but eventually probably up in this part of the world too. Going out to collect seeds, bitterbrush, sagebrush, going out and doing seedling plantings. We have those kind of projects going on now. And also another way, if people want to donate in a monetary way, we do have a page set up where our foundation, where the money that comes in goes directly back to habitat restoration. And I think that's all we had here. If you guys do want to talk more, again, we'll be here in general. And the last thing I wanted to leave you guys with too, just in regards to our big game and elk and deer in particular, right? So our population drivers is that adult survival of our does and our cows. And in any given year, those animals typically survive a good Idaho winter, and they'll then be there on the landscape to help keep going the next year to produce more fawns and calves. In the short term, as we said before, there could be a little bit more of an impact on our fawns and our calves, depending on, again, what kind of winter we get this year. We just, at this point in time, just can't truly glass ball that right now. So That's what we're talking about. We always see natural mortality, no matter what the winter is, on these species. But what we've seen through time here in Idaho is these species are very resilient, and they will rebound and get back to proper populations that we can all enjoy. So thanks for your time tonight. Josh, you want to close us out with anything?
I do want to mention one other thing that we've been talking about in response to fires. We're very fortunate in the Southwest region, so every week the regional supervisors and the director's office and the bureau chiefs get together, and or every other week, and we have a phone call just to calibrate and coordinate across the state. And one of the things that the director likes to see or hear is a fire update as we go through the summer. And it was very interesting to see, and a bit dismaying to me, to be the regional supervisor here, because we go around all the other regions and they say, not really much to talk about for fire. And then we would get to the Southwest region, and we had the bulk of the big fires. As Brant showed you, on Boise National Forest alone, they had huge fire complexes with the Paddock Fire, the Valley Fire, and then all of these fires, to some extent, impact winter range. You hear a lot about winter range. Winter range is the driver. That's the pantry for the future. Those are the foodstuffs, and that's where that forage is what drives those populations through the winter. That's why we're talking about winter range. This area, you're living in a portion of winter range, and it's very visible, it's very accessible, it's right in your backyards, and so I do want to make sure that we manage some expectations. Ryan is spot on. We don't want to be sky is falling, that this is going to decimate populations, because in this area it is not. We don't believe that's the case. But you are going to see increased mortality, likely, for all of the reasons that these folks talked about. You're going to see it, and it's going to be more visible here than it is other places. So when we have hard winters and we have degraded summer transitional, and then thus likely higher impacts to winter range, you're going to see increased mortality. And the fact that we see a dead deer in your backyard, it's not fun, nobody likes it. It's not the end of the world. We anticipate that. I just want everybody to know we're expecting that. We're expecting that across these ranges where we have fire impacted winter ranges especially. So, and that's all across this part of the southern part of Idaho. So that doesn't mean that it's not impactful for you in your backyard and your lifestyle, but as you interact with your community members, we're aware of that, we're anticipating it. And then we also, I would say, staffing wise, we're not going to have the staff to help remove all of these dead critters. So if we end up, we're going to be asking for help from folks, right? If we do have dead mule deer fawns, which is likely what you're going to see, the largest impacts, we're going to need some help from the community and local individuals. Give us a call. But I've only got one Corey for up here, and most of our officers have a patrol area that is between 1,000 and 1,500 square miles. And so Corey's got a lot of territory to cover, and they're not going to be able to get to every single call. And you see the bulk of our wildlife staff is represented here, and that's for an area that it encompasses roughly 25% of the state of Idaho. So. We're a lean agency. We're proud of that. We're proud of the fact that we run lean. But in moments like this, it makes it very difficult, and our partnerships with our community members become even more important than they already are, which is incredibly important to us. So I just want to throw that out there, and then we'll open it up for questions, unless there's something else I missed. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I totally agree, and I'll hit that even a little harder. So as a kid, I grew up as a wildlife lover in Idaho, and I admit I fed wildlife. I'm a recovering wildlife feeder, right? Then I went to school for wildlife, became got a biology degree, wildlife biology degree, And I spent 17 years as a conservation officer responding to haystacks and responding to places where we were finding dead deer eating hot alfalfa with bellies full of alfalfa. Because as these folks, Ryan and David mentioned, they have a very specialized gut that transitions from summer range to winter range. It changes how they process. And if you feed a mule deer that is supposed to be on winter range eating browse and woody debris, hot flake alfalfa, it will die. It just can't process it. And so I get it, I sympathize. People truly want to help. They're doing it with the best of intentions. And we all do it. We all care about wildlife. Those are important things to us. But it's hard to say don't feed them because it doesn't help. But my own experience and those of us that have responded to those can tell you it's not, my experience is not unique by any measure. But we find mule deer especially dead of malnutrition with bellies full of hot alfalfa every single winter. And so feeding those mule deer, they have a full belly and then they won't go find the browse that actually drives them through the winter. So it does way, way more harm than good. And that's a hard message to get at. So I do appreciate that, and I think that's a great idea. We'll spend some time getting some materials out in the community, and hopefully you all can help us spread that word as well.
So, in my neighborhood, which is just right next to the gravel pit here, we don't have mule deer, we have whitetail. I'm assuming that the impact is the same with the whitetail.
Yeah, by and large, yeah. Mule deer seem more susceptible to a whole variety of things. Whitetail are far more resilient, but yeah, you see the same thing in whitetail. They seem to have a better ability to diversify their diet, but alfalfa is not going to help a whitetail.
So explain to us the process when you do go into emergency feeding. How do you feed the deer, and how do you keep them out of the elk?
Great question.
We put up a little sign. No, so we do have specialized deer pellets. They're produced locally here. It is formulated very specifically for them. How do you keep them out of the sites? You kind of don't. Now, in large part, what we've seen in feeding operations is elk will run deer out of preferred areas, and so once they sort of establish kind of that hierarchy in amongst a feeding site, you know, the elk feed is typically just straight alfalfa. It's either pelletized or just flake hay. You know, we try and do later grade cuttings, you know, that aren't as hot with the elk stuff. There is some intermingling there. You know, that is one of the concerns when we're feeding is, are we getting too many deer into the elk sites? You know, a lot of times when we enter into a winter feeding, like an emergency feeding situation, our big concern is for mule deer. One of these guys hit it earlier. When we're talking elk, they're typically gonna find a resource somewhere. So when we're feeding elk, it's normally to prevent some of the public safety issues or getting into feedlots. They're gonna behave badly, if you will, or our estimation of badly. That's typically what we're looking at when we're feeding elk, is to keep them out of some other place. You know, so we would go heavy on you know, deer feed in some of those areas. That's the bigger concern. Elk are gonna go, they're gonna find a resource. We'll go heavy there. But if the two are, you know, intermixed, and we saw this 2 years ago in eastern Idaho, they pretty quickly established, you know, a hierarchy of a preferred place to be, and so you can distribute your food that way. But it is a concern, you know, and that is certainly one of the concerns. Are we inadvertently killing a bunch of deer because, yeah, they don't listen to the little signs. Like, they're real nice signs, but it doesn't work.
This girl just volunteered to be a flagger.
Yeah, she got flagged.
Yeah, perfect. Need all the help we can get. Any other questions? Feel free to come up afterwards and address it individually, and then of course I'm probably going to need a ride back to Boise since I dissed my ride, Matt, earlier, so if anybody's volunteered for that.
I got it.
So
Thanks,
on
David.
elk, rather than a feeding program, would a mineral block or salt help at all?
Typically not. I mean, normally what they're looking for, with all of our ungulates, mule deer and elk, it's kind of a zero-sum game. So they are losing calories all winter long, even in a good winter. So all you're doing is supplementing caloric intake. One of the things that we talked about is, what can you do is not disturb the wildlife. Especially out on winter range, shed hunting, just recreating, going out skiing, not moving those animals around. Anytime they move around, they're burning calories. And they are always going to lose more calories than they're taking in, unless they're in a feedlot or something. And even when we are feeding, we are only looking to match 50% of their dietary intake for a day. So if we had 100 deer showing up on average at a site, as far as how much feed we're putting out, we're going to say what's 50% of their forage for the day. So they're always losing feed. It's just about adding a few extra calories so that they don't hit that threshold of, they can't borrow calories. They run out and they're dead. So it's mostly just, putting calories into that at that time.
Okay, anything else from staff? Corey?
Like I said, I do live locally here, and I don't mind coming and picking up dead animals. If you guys are interested in, I got my phone number, I can give out my phone number to you guys. And there are a couple guys locally here, Frank Travey and Don Cobb, who volunteer for us, and they are very helpful as well, helping pick up that kind of stuff. So we may not be able to get it like right away, but yeah, please don't hesitate to call, or if you have any other issues, sick animals or whatever, please don't hesitate to call.
I did want to mention, we talked a little bit about CWD and not having it detected in this area, but I will say our detection, we have one detection in the region, and it's roughly up about yay is where that detection was. And so the previous hotspot, Slate Creek, which we continue to have multiple detections every year. We've again, this year, harvested animals, roadkill animals. We've had multiple detections again, so we definitely have a hotspot in Slate Creek there. We have one lone detection last year from a hunter-harvested animal, just south of New Meadows. That is roughly the same distance from Slate Creek that we are from that detection. So I don't want to say we don't have CWD here, because we didn't south of New Meadows until we did. And it showed up about the same distance that we are from where that detection is. So we've got the bulk of the samples through the lab so far this year, and no additional detections to date. But once again, for those of you unfamiliar with CWD, once you have it, chronic wasting disease, once you have it, you have it. So it's not going away. We are not going to get rid of CWD in the state of Idaho. We are simply trying to slow the spread. And it was a bunch of, I won't belabor the meeting here with that, because we could talk about that for hours and hours on CWD management. But what we're trying to do is slow the spread. And so when we talk about concentrations of animals, and when winter feeding especially, it's very real. It's very real. We are surrounded as a state by CWD. Washington now has it. And we have fresh detections in northern Idaho in Boundary County. So we continue to have multiple detections. Yes, some of that is, we're looking for it more, so we're finding it more. That's certainly true. But we've been looking for CWD for many, many years. And now it's showing up in places that we had looked for it and haven't found it. So we're happy to talk more about that if you have specific CWD questions. But I did want to mention for the group that just because we don't have it here doesn't mean that we're not concerned about it. We absolutely are. Okay, thank you guys again for coming. We really appreciate your time. And we'll stick around to answer any questions.